Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us for this live performance of Never Again, the story of the Japanese American incarceration, presented by Dukesbay Productions of Tacoma with the Washington State Historical Society. I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that the Washington State Historical Society is located on the traditional lands of the Puyallup people who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We pay respect to their elders, past and present. We are delighted to be bringing you this program as part of the Washington Stay Home Society. You can see what's coming up next with the Washington Stay Home Society series at this website. And you can also consider becoming an ongoing member or an Evergreen League supporter of the Washington State Historical Society. The Evergreen League is a way to continue supporting the Washington State Historical Society on an ongoing basis. When you sign up, you can provide donations on a monthly basis as low as $10 a month. To be part of the Evergreen League, you also receive these wonderful gifts as part of your ongoing donations. Through the Evergreen League, your support can provide gifts to education, exhibitions, collections, and any area that is of greatest need. Thank you for considering. Now I would like to invite up Aya Hashiguchi Clark. As part of this Day of Remembrance, we would like to acknowledge that for the South Puget Sound residents who are of Japanese descent, on May 17th and 18th of 1942, they were forced out of the South Puget Sound region and sent to concentration camps. Initially held at hastily constructed assembly centers, over 120,000 people were eventually sent out of the designated military zones along the Pacific coast inland, considered to be loyal to the enemy. Today's Day of Remembrance programming shares these stories of some of those individuals and what the experience was truly like. When I bring up Aya, who is the editor and director, know that she is introducing this program, and we would like you to go ahead and insert questions and comments in the chat throughout, and we will be joined by all of the actors at the end of the program for a question and answer. And now our director, Aya Hashiguchi Clark. Welcome.
Oh, hello everybody. Thank you for watching today. Back in 2016, a friend of mine said that she thought a play should be written and performed about the Japanese American incarceration. And this was a friend who isn't even Asian American, but just has a general interest in justice for all people in this country. And so I took that comment of hers as a challenge, and I got to work. I discovered the historical archives from Densho, who was a wonderful organization who had recorded testimonies from Japanese American internees from up and down the West Coast. And this included thousands of hours of stories, which I searched through and found enough material for a 2-hour show. Well, that was way too long, in my opinion. So after several months of editing, what you are about to watch is the pared down version, which I like so much better. And all of my closest relatives who were incarcerated during the war are now gone. So it is up to my generation to continue to tell this story so that no one will forget. My family may not be here anymore to tell you these stories themselves, but these authentic voices from camp survivors featured in this play will help us to pass on their legacy of courage and strength and forgiveness. The Japanese have an expression, gaman, which means perseverance. And I hope this play and the personal stories it contains will show you just how my Japanese American parents and grandparents did indeed persevere.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
Pearl Harbor and aftermath.
The bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, stunned the Japanese American community as much as the rest of the country. Japanese Americans would again be shocked when immediately following the bombing, the FBI began going door to door making arrests. Any Japanese immigrant man who was at all prominent was considered a potential spy, including Japanese association officers, language school principals, and Buddhist priests. Without any meaningful due process, these men, mostly heads of families, were summarily separated from their wives and children and incarcerated in Missoula, Montana.
It was the first time I saw my mom cry. But apparently the FBI came very early in the morning, and my mom went to answer the door and they kind of shoved her aside. Not brutally, but shoved her aside. And then they kind of just stormed the house and shook my father, made him get up. When they started going upstairs, my mom shouted upstairs to my sisters who said, "Get dressed, get dressed." And apparently the men thought that my mom was giving some kind of signal or something, because apparently they drew out their guns and rushed upstairs. And then they barged in my sister's room and asked my sisters if they have ever seen anything like this, and showed them the gun. "Does your father have one like this?" My other sister remembers the men putting their hands through the sugar bowls and through the rice bowls and apparently ransacked closets looking for things. My sister says they took away with them 2 items. One was my father's bow. My father apparently was really good with a bow and arrow, and he loved to show off how good he was. The other was sort of a souvenir Japanese sword.
A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he's an American citizen or not. Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, United States Army, Western Defense Command.
Why did the FBI come to see my father? He was recognized as one of the leaders of his Kenjin-kai, Kagoshima. They were all groups in the Japanese community, and he was a spokesman for that group. Well, all the different leaders of the community, they even took reverence. They took presidents of organizations, people who were designated as people that could lead the community one way or another were visited, and many of them were just taken away. So there was this system of people calling each other and just warning them that they were on their way to your place. They knew that eventually, everyone kind of knew that eventually if they had someone, a father that seemed to have a role in the community, then that person will be visited too. So when they finally came to our house, I remember being in the other room with my 2 brothers and my mother. And there were these 2 big guys that came and were talking to my dad about this. And then my mother told me, she whispered in my ear in Japanese, to run over there and grab hold of Papa and start crying. And then she told the other 2, my 2 brothers, to go there and just look very sad. So then we did as we were told. I didn't quite understand why we were doing this, but at that point, you do what your parents tell you to do, and especially what Mama said. So I ran over there and I grabbed a hold of his pant legs and I started crying and hollering. And then my brothers were there holding on to Papa. And my dad was startled. But then he saw the effect it had on the FBI agents. They kind of looked and they had all this bedlam and crying and everything going on. So finally they left. And then after, I was to learn that my mother had purposely planned this, that she would have us kids run over there and make such a scene that they would think twice about. Because actually it was left up to each of the visitors to determine whether that person would be one to remove. And I guess at the beginning when they started picking people up, they didn't know this. And later on, they began to see that these are human beings that are doing this. Even if they are told that their orders are to go and grab a person, they couldn't help but be affected by a family man. And my father didn't have to go. I think my mother had some reserves in her that she never showed us until it really was necessary, like standing firm about not going back to Japan, and then at this point doing that. But she never really used that too often. I had always thought of her as very passive and submissive.
No citizen can hold a dual allegiance and be a loyal American. I mean, Japs and Japs only. For the Italians and the Germans are few and far between who are not here in good faith, and the few exceptions can easily be brought to book. And I personally know a Jap who's, to all indications, a big shot among his kind, who, when his son completed high school, whisked him off to Japland to enter college. Anyone suggesting that Papa Jap is a trustworthy American resident and entitled to be free at large and conducting a business under the same protection as other people is just putting up an argument that won't add up for me. Herd them up, ship them to labor camps, and when we have finished slaughtering their progenitors in the old country, then herd them up again and send them all back. Letter to the editor, Seattle Post-Intelligencer, February 5th, 1942.
But when evacuation orders came through, we just couldn't believe our ears. For days, we would hear commentators, especially from California, who began saying, "We're going to put those Japs in camps behind barbed wire." And Chick and I would say, "Oh, that means our parents because they're aliens." They couldn't become citizens. The law forbade them to become citizens. So we're saying we'll have to go visit them, not realizing that, my goodness, they meant us too.
Mass removal.
On March 2nd, 1942, Public Proclamation number 1 began to appear on telephone poles and buildings. This was the first official notice Japanese Americans had of their immediate removal from the West Coast. The notices stated that they had 6 or 7 days to prepare and were to take only what they could carry. They were not told where they would be taken. People rushed to sell or store in 1 week property and belongings acquired over a lifetime. Some families tucked their valuables away in their attic or basement, hoping to return soon, but not knowing for sure how safe their possessions, or their homes for that matter, would be during the incarceration. On the appointed evacuation day, thousands of Japanese Americans gathered at designated locations with the numbered identification tags that they'd been issued tied to their coats. Watched by curious onlookers, they were met by armed soldiers and transported in buses, private cars, and trains to 16 temporary assembly centers in California, Washington, Oregon, and Arizona.
And it all kind of happened very quickly. And so people started either selling their goods out of their homes or trying to think of places to put their belongings, because then it said that we would only be able to carry 1 suitcase.
Now, if I recall, I think a lot about the items we stored that they claimed were lost in a fire. They claimed it burned down. But when you work all your life for things, all taken away at the stroke of a pen.
And this is what I put down in my diary for the first day. The last day in Tacoma. Feel kind of blue, but also looking forward to our trip. We bade farewell to all our friends, and that was the hardest of all. Around 1 o'clock, went down to Chinese Garden, had our last meal in Tacoma. At 2:45, we locked our front door, looked around the garden, and with a sort of empty feeling, turned our back on our home for the last 10 years. The station was a hubbub of people all trying to look unconcerned and doing a pretty good job at that. We boarded the train, car E, seat 7, and at 10 minutes to 6, we were on our way. We passed railroad yards, the lumber mills, around Point Defiance Park, Salmon Beach, 6th Avenue, under the still proud-looking broken Narrows Bridge, then Steilacoom Beach.
I know the Army trucks did come onto Bainbridge Island and started rounding people up. We're all on the ferry by around 11:20. And I know there's a photo of a family and their dog. The dog wanted to go too. So we jumped onto the truck, and I guess the soldiers, with some trepidation, tried to get him off. And finally, the family helped the dog get off. Yeah, they had to leave the pet with a neighbor. And I guess the dog refused to eat and died within about a month.
And we walked down the hill. It's about 4 blocks or so, kind of a fairly steep hill, but we walked straight down and right into Tacoma's Union Station. Oh, yes, one thing that I could remember well, I did take a look back once about halfway down. I just took one final look and nobody else did. And then my dad, I remember him saying, you know, when I came from Japan, I had only one suitcase. He says, I have 2 now. And he wasn't worried about whatever else he couldn't take with him.
Assembly centers.
In spring 1942, the Wartime Civil Control Administration, the WCCA, hastily prepared temporary assembly centers to house the individuals of Japanese ancestry who were removed from their homes after the signing of Executive Order 9066. The centers were surrounded by barbed wire fences and patrolled by armed military police. After spending up to 6 months in the assembly centers, Japanese Americans were moved inland to permanent concentration camps. The assembly centers were hastily erected quarters located throughout the West Coast at fairgrounds, racetracks, and other similar facilities, including the Puyallup Fairgrounds. Conditions at these locations were appalling. People were housed in animal stalls and barracks with communal bathrooms and mess halls. Privacy was next to non-existent. Most families lived in a 20 by 20 foot room separated from the next apartment by wood partitions that did not reach the ceiling. Shortages of food and deplorable sanitation were common. Overcrowding, uncertainty, and stress created tension in the assembly centers, even as the demoralized camp inmates tried to improve living conditions.
Camp Harmony. That was a hell of a good name. I'd been to Puyallup a few times when it was the fairgrounds of the Western Washington. Little did I know that I would replace the pigs and the cows and that kind of stuff, you know, because they restructured the fairgrounds and the parking lots into these temporary hovels. And they had a hell of a lot of nerve calling it Camp Harmony. But anyway, it was a real traumatic kind of living. You know, you're in the former stalls where the pigs and the cows and everything else were. Temporary shacks, just the walls were so many feet off the ground, and families of 6 and 7 were crowded into one little spot.
When I think of Puyallup, I think of only one thing, and that we lived under a grandstand. And so when we signed up for our quarters, we ended up with horse stalls. I mean, literally horse stalls. So we had one horse stall in which we had 4 camp cots and one naked bulb hanging from the ceiling. I was lying on my bunk and I was looking at the wall and I was flicking away at the wall when I realized it was whitewashed and underneath it was dung. I mean, horse dung. And I realized what I had scratched up was horse dung.
We had barbed wire fencing all around the fairgrounds. There was a road that passed by close to the fairgrounds. and they would bring busloads of non-Japanese people, and they would actually let them off and let them look at us like we were, like we were caged animals. They actually came and looked at us while we were behind barbed wire fencing there. So we were some kind of attraction.
Minidoka.
The War Relocation Authority, WRA, oversaw construction of 10 concentration camps in sparsely populated and isolated areas. Between June and October 1942, Japanese Americans were transferred from the assembly centers to the larger camps, one of which was the Minidoka War Relocation Center near Hunt, Idaho. The residents of Minidoka worked hard to make life as normal for themselves as possible. The children were enrolled in schools and participated in Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts. Church services were held, baseball games were played, and young women even competed in beauty pageants.
The move from Puyallup to Minidoka. That was in August of 1942. I think that's when we took our first train trip. Well, as I told you, our family never had a car. I had never been on a train. And the barracks were very dusty and unfurnished. And I think there were cots there, but we still had to get our mattresses and army blankets and all lined up. 7 beds all lined up and a pot-belly stove at one end. But somehow I give credit to the Issei's for not making a big fuss about how awful conditions are and just accepting what's there and making the best of it. That's all I could remember. Because gradually somebody got a table or built a table and we had tables and chairs, but until then there wasn't any. And gradually people started to make a garden outside their door, porch, and learning to use public facilities like showers and restrooms and laundry facilities. To have to share all that and learning to live together without fighting it is quite an adjustment. Community living, sharing.
I didn't like what was going on in camp. Number one, below the barracks, it's wide open, and I want to close that. Use the local people to close that. And here we had all the plumbing sitting out in the desert. Why can't we put it in? And I, as a civil engineer, I know exactly what to do. And why can't we use people in the camp? And the camp will say, hey, we have contracts out and such and such and such and such. We can't do anything. And I'm cold. I'm not feeling good. And I have to go out to the John out between the blocks. And here it is 20 below zero. Hey, let's get with it. All of this is starting to come back. All the things that we could do and all the things we weren't allowed to do. And we're the ones suffering.
Well, it was horrible. I mean, even as a child, I remember it was an experience to go to the bathroom or to go to the mess hall to eat, which was fun. But the weather, it was bad. You're always slopping in the mud. I remember the older men, members of the community, they made wooden clogs, geta. And yeah, as a matter of fact, I had a pair, but I didn't use them because you had to wear them with bare feet, and in the winter you couldn't use them. The winds were just horrible when we went there. I remember even as a child. The barracks, as you might see in some pictures, were built above ground. They were not on slabs of concrete above ground. And there was an opening of 2 feet at least from the ground to the floor, the bottom part of the flooring. And that was just a constant wind tunnel, if you will. And then in the barrack itself, there was only 1 plank. In other words, one 1x6 that separated you from the ground. And there were cracks in between. And the winds. I mean, the deserts of southern Idaho and the winds during the spring, for instance, or in the summer. When we first moved there, that dust would come up and go and permeate everything within that room. And we only had 1 room for the whole family. It was brutal. The dust was just as brutal as the cold, and the cold was bad too. You either froze or you boiled to death.
And oh, it was so dusty, you just can't imagine. It was just such a desert place with sagebrush and tumbleweeds rolling all over.
After we got there on train, they had trucks that drove us to our campsite. And I recall it was so dusty, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. This condition was severe, out of nowhere, desert country. Public facilities, there was nothing to speak of. They had outhouses. Later on, they put in running water, but it was just plain desert, south central Idaho.
Well, I remember when we first got there, the only thing I could remember was the dust.
Well, it was very, very discouraging because, as I say, the wind and the dust storm, and you must remember that the camp was still under construction. Therefore, all this dust was being created with the wind blowing it up.
Very dusty. The wind was blowing.
After we got there on the train, they had trucks that drove us to our campsite. And I recall it was so dusty, I couldn't see my hand in front of my face.
Sagebrush and dust, dust and sagebrush.
It was very, very dusty. The dust was powdery, fine, and if I recall, it was about 3 or 4 inches deep. So you just, every time you take a step, you would just have a puff of smoke, of dust. And if you even have the slightest breeze, wow, you're in like a fog. And when you go in the mess hall to eat, of course, when you chew the food, you can feel the grit of the sand. And it's amazing. Even that, you get used to it. I gradually got used to the mixture of sand and food. It was terrible.
The Loyalty Questionnaire.
To help administer the military draft and work release program, the U.S. Army and the War Relocation Authority produced loyalty questionnaires for all Japanese Americans 17 years of age and older. The questionnaires contain 2 questions that caused confusion and controversy. Despite serious problems with the wording and meaning of the questions, government officials and others generally considered those who answered no to these 2 questions to be disloyal to the United States, and they were transferred to the Tule Lake concentration camp, which was designated a segregation camp. Yes answers to these questions made Japanese Americans eligible for service in the U.S. Army.
Question 27. Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered?
Thinking it over, I thought to myself, it sounded like you're going to volunteer. Well, we'd been pushed around quite a bit, and I didn't like it. So I said, I don't want to be pushed around anymore, so I'm going to answer no. I'm not going to volunteer.
Question 28. Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any and all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization?
I answered on 28. I said yes, because that was 3 questions all put into one. The first one, what was it?
The unqualified allegiance to the United States.
I said yes to that one.
And then the second one was defend the US from all attack by foreign or domestic.
Yes, I said yes. If our 48 states, at that time we only had 48, were attacked.
And then the third part was forswear any allegiance to the Japanese emperor.
I never swore any allegiance to Japan. I've always been an American and pledged allegiance to our flag all my life. Therefore, I said no there, because I never had allegiance to the emperor, so I couldn't forswear allegiance. I was too young to know what the heck I was saying. So anyway, I said no to that question. And 2 questions out of 3 was yes. Therefore, my last answer to the whole question was yes.
I had something that I wanted to prove to the government that they can't do this. I didn't want to just blindly follow whatever they tell us to prove your loyalty. What loyalty? I was loyal. Why should I prove? Like answering questions 27 and 28. Yeah, I said yes on 27. I said, sure, send me anywhere, I'll go. On 28, I said no. Number 1, because I did not pledge allegiance to any other country, flag, whatever. And in 1943, I'm saying, what for? Why should I now, all of a sudden, pledge allegiance while staying in a concentration camp? Well, I was convicted and I was given 3 years, 10 months at McNeil Island.
I recall that when the questionnaire came out, there was a lot of confusion because we didn't know the purpose really behind it. Was it going to be used to segregate us? The effort of this questionnaire was actually started in Washington, D.C. in order to determine how many men would be eligible to be served in the armed forces. There was an effort by the War Department to find out how many Nikkei men would be available to establish a combat team.
The story of the Japanese Americans in the military during World War II is complex and in many ways ironic. It's a story of mistrust by the very country for which these soldiers placed themselves in harm's way. Many were drafted directly out of the camps and fought for democracy abroad, while their parents and families were incarcerated by their own government. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team was initially formed in 1943 from Japanese American volunteers from Hawaii and the mainland. Perhaps not surprisingly, only about 1,200 Japanese Americans volunteered. Another 1,500 were drafted. In the 2 years, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team in Europe became the most decorated US Army regiment of its size. In less than 10 months, it had earned 7 Presidential Unit citations and more than 9,000 Purple Hearts. Along with a Medal of Honor, there were 29 Distinguished Service Crosses, 330 Silver Crosses, and more than 2,000 Bronze Stars. In the Pacific, 6,000 Japanese Americans trained as linguists and served as interpreters, interrogators, translators, and radio message interceptors in the Military Intelligence Service. General Douglas MacArthur considered them crucial in the war against Japan. Never has a commander gone into battle as did the Allied commanders Southwest Pacific, knowing so much about the enemy.
Well, I wasn't drafted. In March, I volunteered for the Air Force, but then my draft card says 4C, enemy alien. Enemy alien? What do you mean enemy alien? I'm an American. Your draft card says 4C, enemy alien. We can't take you. So I wasn't able to. No, they wouldn't take me. So I went back home, waited around, then I volunteered again. But I couldn't volunteer until Roosevelt signed the decree that we could join the Army. Roosevelt signed the decree, and that's when they formed the 442nd. Then I volunteered.
Returning home.
When the camps closed, Japanese Americans were handed $25 and put on trains headed for the places they'd been forcibly removed from nearly 4 years earlier. Harassment was common. Many returning Japanese Americans were greeted with signs reading, "No Japs allowed." Others discovered their property had been vandalized or stolen. Homes and businesses that had been boarded up or left in the care of others were abandoned and stripped of furnishings and goods. For the majority, who did not have homes to return to, housing was the most serious problem. Housing discrimination was severe in many areas and persisted in varying degrees until the civil rights legislation of the 1960s. Former camp inmates with no other options moved into hostels and converted community institutions with conditions not much better than the camps they had just left. Although this period was stressful, it is remembered as a time when people came together to share what they had.
Having no resources, no property, nothing left over from before the war, and to drop us back into Seattle and say, now start over. I think my father was given only $14 at the time to leave camp. And so I remember boarding a bus, and we got to this bus terminal. I think it was on 2nd Avenue somewhere. And so from there, my parents and I carried our suitcase and walked up Jackson Avenue to the Japanese language school. And we met the Kinoshita family for the very first time. But they were very, very gracious people and welcomed us. So we were sharing space with another family again, just like in camp.
When we were given permission by the 3 governors that we could come back to the West Coast, they were all initially against our return. They asked us not to come back. I remember because my parents wouldn't go to another state. They wanted and always hoped to return to Seattle. They wanted to go home, back to Seattle. Home was not Japan because of their children who were American. They paid a tremendous penalty. The dreams, their dreams, were put down under racism and misunderstanding.
I know one of the families that came back couldn't get the family occupying their home off their land, and struggled that for a long time, and finally ended up selling it to them because they couldn't get them to move. There was one family in Kingston who gave their Caucasian neighbors power of attorney on their property in case something happened. And they sold the land without their knowledge, didn't give them any of the money. I know Kay talks about her family coming back to their house, and they couldn't get the Caucasian renter out of their house. And that every time she was supposed to pay the rent, she would write and tell them that she had to repair this or repair that, and would never pay her rent. So when they came back from the internment camp, she refused to leave. So the family finally moved into the basement. And this person refused to leave upstairs. And so one day she said, one day her father decided he was going to cook as many Japanese foods as he could that smelled awful. And he did that a few days, and she left. So there's always a way to do something, I guess. The Japanese way.
My parents spent part of their youth in Minidoka during the war. As a 3rd-generation Japanese American, I was also a victim of that experience during my own upbringing, even though I was born long after the war. I believe they call that generational trauma. I think our elders never wanted us to suffer or be accused like they were of being un-American for simply being Japanese. So our childhood was as American as they could give us. I remember the Christmas parties they put on at the Japanese Congregational Church. I was so excited every year to celebrate Christmas, just like everyone else. Our Nisei parents pulled out all the stops for us kids. And it took me years to even realize that when Santa arrived at the party and gave us our gifts, Santa Claus looked suspiciously like a short Japanese man in a red costume. I guess that never really mattered, though. It was Christmas.
Redress and reparations.
In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed into law the Civil Liberties Act, which, among other things, mandated an official apology from the government and monetary payments to Japanese Americans incarcerated during World War II. On October 9th, 1990, more than 2 years after the passage of the bill, the first of the redress payments of $20,000 per person were made in a formal ceremony to elderly Issei survivors in Washington, D.C. Similar ceremonies were held in cities across the country. While few of those who are incarcerated feel that the government's apology erases what was done, many believe that a formal admission of wrongdoing helped resolve feelings of shame and corrected misperceptions held by the larger society.
Well, don't forget, as far as getting it and appreciating it, but you know, like I think the 20,000, I don't think it never could replace the freedom we had, the freedom we lost. Like we said, I could tell my students that when I talk to them. You know, you lose your rights, your constitutional rights, you don't realize it until you do. I said, you get stuck there behind a fence like that, losing your own constitutional right and all that, because technically speaking, you're a person without a country.
A monetary sum and words alone cannot restore lost years or erase painful memories. Neither can they fully convey our nation's resolve to rectify injustice and to uphold the rights of individuals. We can never fully right the wrongs of the past, but we can take a clear stand for justice and recognize that serious injustices were done to Japanese Americans during World War II. In enacting a law calling for restitution and offering a sincere apology, your fellow Americans have, in a very real sense, renewed their traditional commitment to the ideals of freedom, equality, and justice. You and your family have our best wishes for the future. George H.W. Bush, President of the United States, October 1990.
Epilogue.
The internment was a dark chapter of American history in which 120,000 people, including me and my family, lost our homes, our livelihoods, and our freedoms because we happened to look like the people who bombed Pearl Harbor. I was just a child of 5 when we were forced at gunpoint from our home and sent first to live in a horse stable at a local racetrack, a family of 5 crammed into a single smelly stall. It was a devastating blow to my parents, who had worked so hard to buy a house and raise a family in Los Angeles. After several weeks, they sent us much farther away, 1,000 miles to the east by rail car. The blinds of our train cars pulled for our protection, they said. We disembarked in the fetid swamps of Arkansas at the Rower Relocation Center. Really, it was a prison. Armed guards looked down upon us from sentry towers. Their guns pointed inward at us. Searchlights lit pathways at night. We understood we were not to leave. We cannot permit this invidious thinking, discredited by history at the cost of so much misery and suffering by innocents, to take root once again in America, let alone in the White House. The stigmatization, separation, and labeling of our fellow humans based on race or religion has never led to a more secure world, but it has too often led to one where the most vulnerable pay the highest price. The Constitution and the government exist in large measure to protect against the excesses of democracies. This is particularly salient when, in an atmosphere of fear or mistrust, one group is singled out and vilified, as Japanese Americans were during World War II, and as Muslim Americans are today. How terrible it is to contemplate, once again, that the government itself might once more be the very instrument of terror and division. That cannot happen again. We cannot allow it. George Takei, editorial in the Washington Post, November 2016.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to bring everybody back up. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for that performance. And we hope to do a little bit of question and answer with everybody who is joining us out there in Facebook Live land. So I'll just go ahead and get us started with the initial question. Aya, I was hoping that as the director and editor of this particular play, maybe you could reiterate what you said at the beginning and just tell us again why you were motivated to create this play.
Well, it was several years ago, I think 2016. I was having a conversation with actually an African-American friend of mine, and she told me how she was interested in knowing more about the Japanese-American incarceration, and she felt that there should be a theatrical piece written about it, and that we in Tacoma should do it. And so I sort of took that challenge and got to work, and with the help of the organization Densho, which has chronicled the testimonies of so many Japanese Americans who were incarcerated. I just sifted through thousands of hours of testimony and highlighted mostly the stories of people from Seattle and Tacoma. And this is what happened.
That is incredible. Densho is such an amazing resource, and there are so many oral history interviews, written stories, digitized newspapers that were actually from each of those concentration camps. How were you able to sift through all of that amazing material and then make your selection for how you were going to organize this play?
All I could say is that it must have been magic, because I'm not really a writer or an editor. I was just reading so much testimony, and the ones that just stood out to me, I saved. And I put them all together, and somehow, I can't tell you how I did it. It was just all magical.
So we do have a question from Tamiko. She asks, as a sensei, did you learn anything new while editing and compiling this play?
Well, I did, because I came from a household where my mother and father were actually rather silent about this. My brother Ko, who is also one of the readers in this play, he and I mostly learned about the internment through third parties. We didn't really learn a lot firsthand from our parents. And so hearing and reading testimonies from Niseis who were willing to speak out, I learned a whole lot of information and details that my parents never told me. So
I can imagine that's,
yeah.
Yes. And that's why it's so important to have things like this play as an introduction to learning more about this very important history. And speaking of that connection that you have personally, I was wondering if any of the readers, the other performers, would like to share about their own personal connections to this story.
I'll go. So both my parents' generation and grandparents were all interned, and my parents, like Aya's, did not speak much about it. When we were older, they would answer some questions, but kind of interestingly to now, my mother is 93 years old and she has some dementia. And only recently she stresses about the home she left behind when they were transferred to the camps. So she worries about kittens that were left, and she says that they had buried some silver under the porch. We don't know where they live, or I'd do a little treasure hunt, but but it's kind of, to me, very sad that this trauma from when she was 15 years old has suddenly come to life, and it's like it's today for her with her dementia.
I think, like everybody here, my parents never talked about it. And in fact, when I read about it in US history, like in the 7th grade, there was like one paragraph about this unfortunate chapter in American history. And I just was like flabbergasted. I went, is that the camps my parents keep talking about? And I went home and I asked them about it. My dad actually got mad. He says, I don't know why you guys want to know anything about that. That's in the past. And then later when I became an actor and did a couple of plays that were about the internment camps, my dad came and went, you kids, why do you want to go over this stuff? It's just something that happened. And, you know, I realized that it was such a painful thing. And at the time, I think a lot of people also carried some shame, like, you know, they were somehow ashamed of that this happened to them. But, you know, after that, my dad would, you know, after he'd had a few, he'd talk about it a little bit. And one of the things that stood out for me was just like one of the characters in this play, he said, you know, he didn't think that they had to worry because they were citizens. It was the Issei that had to be worried. So he was shocked when they all got rounded up. And he said he remembered being on the trains and somebody saying, when then they pulled down the shades and they said so that other people wouldn't see them. But there was a rumor going around that they were going to get taken out to the desert and shot. And my dad said, well, you know, of course that sounded crazy, but then I thought, I didn't think this was going to happen. So who knows what they'll do to us.
My family's story is a little different because my parents came from Japan after the war. So I'm actually a fairly young Nisei, second generation Japanese American. But the story is so important. So growing up on the East Coast, moving here, I did get pretty involved with the Japanese American Citizens League, who is an organization looking out for civil rights. And years ago, I went on the Minidoka pilgrimage. There's a group that does a yearly pilgrimage. And that's where I got to see the actual, just the area in Idaho that is told in these stories. So it's very moving and hard to imagine today if this happened that I would be going into a camp. So it's like Aya's title of the story, it's really important, I think, to share this story so that things like this never happen again.
Well, there's only one detail from that period of time, only one, that I got from either mom or dad. And it's not actually directly connected to the camps. But dad was in the 442nd Regiment. So he served in Italy and southern France. So that, again, it's not directly related to the camps, but it's the only piece I heard from either of them ever. And it was simply the comment that when dad was watching a war film of some sort or the other, and he says, just out of the blue, once you smell burned human flesh, you never forget it. And that's the sum total of everything, anything that either mom or dad had to say about that period of time. The war, the internment, anything. And frankly and honestly, I think that kind of behavior out of our parents was, you know, Aya's and my parents is typical, you know. That generation of Japanese American people, they just didn't, it was a better thing and a more noble thing not to complain. So they didn't.
Can I throw something in about Densho? You know, like Ko and Aya's dad, my father also served in the 442. And, you know, we'd ask him questions and he'd say, well, you know, I basically was a litter bearer, meaning he carried dead people off the battlefield. And then I think maybe sometime in the 80s, Densho interviewed him, and they gave him like a 2-hour uncut VHS tape of his interviews. And so once he went out bowling, and my mom said, you want to listen to the interview? I said, yeah. I heard all these crazy things that he'd never told us. You know, just stuff about battle, what it was like, you know, and it was nightmarish. It was horrifying. And of course, in his typical Nisei way, it was all kind of like, and then this happened, and then, you know, but it was Densho was the only way I could hear these stories, because he always played it completely down when we'd ask him.
We, especially in the history, you know, researching community, are so grateful to Densho because they have done such an amazing job of gathering all of those important stories and just making people feel respected and that their stories are valued. So I think once their project really started getting going, that encouraged other individuals to open up and really start to share and hopefully strip away some of that shame that I know was mentioned. We're so grateful for all of their work, and this play wouldn't have been possible without hearing all of those many different stories, because I think that's one thing that is really challenging about telling this history is to give the overall facts. It tends to make Japanese Americans sound as a monolith. But when you really dig into all of these individual stories, you hear all of the different responses, where people were coming from, and really acknowledge that these were 120,000 individuals that had those different experiences. So that's what I so deeply appreciate about this play in particular. And I'll mention that you're just getting a lot of love and respect from everyone that's out there viewing this evening, lots of well dones, and that this is very important history to make sure to commemorate through this. And then also just thank yous for sharing your individual family stories and your connection to this history. So it looks like we're just about out of time, but any final thoughts or comments? Maybe is this play going to be shown again? Do you have any other plans for the future?
Well, in this age of COVID, we aren't able to do this in person, but we are really hoping to once again do some in-person performances, because there's something very powerful about seeing the actors right there in the room with you. And that was why we were able to pull off a 2-hour show that first time, and we didn't lose a single person, and their attention were just riveted on us the entire time. But this show will also be, and I think this very taped performance that we just did will be shown online during Japan Fair in June. I can't tell you all the details of that yet, but we will be featured in that. Even though Japan Fair is largely about Japanese culture, the organizers liked the idea of showing this play because they said it showed a great example of Japanese resilience and perseverance in this country. So, yeah.
Absolutely. And please let us know when it's going to be shown again in person, because yes, we're happy to do these things virtually while we can't be in person, but I just imagine that it's so incredible to hear it in person, as you said. So thank you all so much for joining us. I'm going to give the whole view again so we can applaud all of you. Thank you so much. This has been a wonderful, wonderful virtual program. And thank you all out there for joining us. Really quickly, I just want to say thank you yet again here to our director and editor, the entire cast, Dukesbay Productions, for making this possible. And then please be sure to get on our website, check out all of our upcoming Washington Stay Home Society programming, learn about becoming a member or an Evergreen League supporter. And then actually again tonight at 7 p.m., we are going to do our first University of Washington Tacoma Scholarly Selections virtually. And the panel discussion is Never Again Is Now, Japanese American Incarceration, Anti-Asian Violence, and Immigration Detention in the 21st Century. So join us right here on Facebook Live again for that event. And thank you for joining us for this live performance for our Day of Remembrance. Take care.